This is a relay project.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
We got a lot of ground to cover in this episode of Real Talk, and we're grateful that you're with us. Professor Timothy Caulfield joining us in studio. We're going to get into that Manning report. The COVID review, the government review essentially commissioned by the Danielle Smith government, tapping on the shoulder, the founder of the Reform Party, the godfather of conservative politics in Western Canada, unless Stephen Harper deserves the title, or maybe Tom Flanagan. I don't know. Maybe we'll ask Tim Caulfield in just a second. But a bit of a gaffe. An embarrassing gaffe by Manning yesterday. You may have seen this, and the plot thickens. Not only is the panel review out 90 recommendations on how Alberta as a jurisdiction should handle something like COVID in future, but an email sent by Preston to conservative loyalists and accidentally, you would assume, the Liberal MP down in Calgary, George Chahal, the lonely George Chahal, the former city councillor who, of course, is representing a government that's polling very unfavorably in Alberta, but he was handed on a silver platter yesterday some inside baseball commentary by Manning himself on the motivation behind the report and how Preston, former leader of the federal official opposition, obviously, believes that the data, the findings can be weaponized against the NDP in Alberta, and of course that Liberal NDP coalition government federally. We're going to talk to Professor Caulfield about restoring faith in media. I want to get into vaccines and a whole lot more, but first I want to give a quick shout out to those of you right now that are looking for a change. You're looking for a high-paying career, but right now you're going to say, I don't have a university degree. Maybe I wished I would have done it, or heck no, maybe that just wasn't for me, but I'm still looking for something rewarding and something where I can do more than just pay my bills. Well, you can get started as an insurance professional today with Business Career College. In Canada, insurance agents are typically starting right around $55,000 a year. They can soon rise to around $90,000 annually. All you need to do is take an approved course, pass your licensing exam, and BCC offers industry-leading approved courses in life insurance, property and casualty insurance. Plus, their expert instructors are passionate about helping you launch your career. They're in it to support you for the long haul. And right now, there's an awesome opportunity for Real Talkers. You can save 15% off any Business Career College insurance course with the code Real Talk. That's all one word, Real Talk, at businesscareercollege.com. Professor Tim Caulfield, a good friend of this show. Obviously, you've heard him or you've seen him here before talking about myth-busting, talking about health law and science policy. That's his wheelhouse at the University of Alberta. He's also been a Netflix TV host. He's the author of several best-selling books, and he might be the most trolled person on Alberta Twitter. Is that a fair assessment?
I don't know if I'm the most. Let's put me in the Venn diagram of likely the most.
I honestly think, and as somebody who used to think that I got trolled a lot, and then I've seen other people get trolled quite a bit. Danielle Smith gets trolled a lot. Rachel Notley gets trolled a lot. I don't think anybody even comes close to you. You bring people out of the woodwork from all around the world, and that's not always a good thing.
I'm honored that you you think of me that way. It is brutal, and I will say it's changed. It wasn't always, you've been on social media on various platforms.
Years and years.
And I used to be about, I'm going to say 10% of what I got was nasty trolling, harassment. I think, if I post something, and I know what's coming too. I know what's coming. I post something, I would say 90% of the responses are it's harassment, death threats. It's nasty out there now.
For people that are listening to this on the podcast, that'll be the majority. They can't tell you have a gleam in your eye and you're smiling when you're talking about how nasty it is and the death threats that you're getting. But I imagine that there's an element of seriousness to that. Let me tell you anecdotally, just yesterday, and I appreciate this, you were letting people know that you were going to be joining me on the show. You tweet about how the information ecosystem has become a massive false balance machine. You say fringe positions that have already been studied and shown to be wrong are legitimized, given a huge profile. You share a link to a piece you've written that we'll get into, and then you tag me in the tweet. You say I'm going to be on with Jespo in the morning, and then all of a sudden my mentions just become this hot garbage fire, and it just reiterated to me that the field of what you do, which is telling the truth based on evidence-based policy findings, research, etc., isn't always an easy road to hoe, and maybe now a little bit more difficult than ever before. Everybody's got a big voice and everybody's using it.
Yeah, it is really unfortunate because, someone like me, I'm old, I'm going to be out to pasture soon, right? And then but I worry about what this environment does to those young, diverse voices that are coming up. We need these voices in the conversation. So young academics, young policy people, young clinicians, and they don't want to get out there and engage in conversation. So yeah, I can laugh about it, but I think it is a real problem how toxic it has become out there, and you end up sort of you edit yourself, right? Do I really need to post this, and do I really need the hate, the emails, the complaints to my university, et cetera, which is terrible. It's terrible.
But it's also like you want to share the information that you're gleaning. You want to share the thoughts that you have. You want to be a good source of information and kind of play in the space where a lot of the misinformation's happening, right? So it's a bit of a catch-22. You got to be there if you want to make an impact, but by being there, you open yourself up to a bunch of stuff.
Exactly right. And so, I've actually, written about this. I think institutions, so, government, universities, research institutions, they've got to support their colleagues that want to get out there and do their best to represent what the science actually says in a field. And also professional organizations, I think, need to do that. And I think Ryan, I think we're starting to see that shift. I think people are recognizing how important it is to engage the public in a respectful manner and really try to represent the science accurately.
I saw that on Twitter yesterday, or a few days ago anyway, you had shared Elizabeth Thompson's piece for CBC where she's reporting on foreign states targeting Canadians through social media, warning from Canada's spy agency, basically from CSIS. This is a thing. We're not immune to it. Everybody talks about Russian interference, Chinese interference in American elections, alleged and otherwise. But here it is right here in Canada.
That's right. And I think that a lot of people don't recognize the impact that state actors are having on our public discourse. We know, for example, that state actors, so, Russia, China, are impacting how Canadians are talking about vaccines, climate change, ivermectin. There have been studies that have shown that they are just trying to create information chaos in Canada. And Ryan, they're succeeding. People are buying into these narratives that are being introduced by state actors. And of course, now what's going on in the Middle East is just ramped up even more. So yeah, this is, I really think the spread of misinformation, and there's, again, research to back this up, is one of the most pressing issues of our time, not just in my space, the health space, but really when you're talking about democracy.
What's the motivation? Like, maybe I'm about to hit the nail on the head, or maybe there's so much more to it, but in creating information chaos, is it simply to destabilize? Like, what's the end game, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to touch on something we're going to explore together. Absolutely, just creating information chaos is an advantage for state actors, right? Because it makes our society more inefficient, right? It makes it more difficult to explore topics. Just think about something like ivermectin. We know ivermectin, that
the horse dewormer, right?
That antiparasitic that. Yes, it won the Nobel Prize. Yes, it's a very effective antiparasitic. Yes, it's used in all over the world for that purpose. There's never been any evidence to suggest that it's effective in COVID, but still, a huge percentage of the Canadian population believes that. That's because of misinformation. But think about all the research that has been done, Ryan, on ivermectin, the millions and millions and millions of dollars that have been spent all over the world, kind of to disprove a myth. Right? This drug was investigated. It was found not to be effective, but the research continues because it's almost like we have to continue to. That's a win for state actors, right? Because we're wasting resources, we're wasting public discussion on this topic. But the other reason that state actors want to do this, and this is so relevant to what we're going to talk about today, they want to create distrust. They want to create distrust in institutions. They want to get Canadians to distrust institutions because that is a win for other countries, and it harms liberal democracies like Canada.
It's working. Right?
It's working.
Like
it's working. Oh my God, is it working?
There's polling to suggest, there's research. We've talked about it on the show lots about how distrust right now in institutions, and it's not just the media, but the media is there, but also education. And you could almost say institutions with a capital I and leave it like that.
100%. And in fact, there was a study that came out of the United States, I'm going to say last week or the week before. Listen to this. Trust in science and scientists is the lowest it has been in like 30, 40 years, right? And only 57% of Americans now say that science has benefited them. Like, which is absurd. They're probably tweeting about it, right? They're probably sitting on an airplane 30,000 feet above the sky, the ground, tweeting about it. And science hasn't benefited them at all, right? As they're taking their medication for their heart problems, or
drinking pasteurized milk, or eating GMO food, or whatever.
Yeah, that is fully the result of the spread of misinformation and the creation of distrust. And we know that because if you look at the cohort of the population where you see the biggest change in distrust, it's among a particular political leaning community, right? And I want to be really, really clear here. Institutions, universities, clinical institutions need to do better. There are reasons why valid reasons why there could be distrust, right? And people often point to those reasons and blame institutions for the distrust. But I understand that. In fact, my next book, forthcoming book, really explores the way that institutions have screwed up. So I'm fully aware of that. But if you look at the research, the majority of the distrust has been generated by the spread of misinformation, the embrace of ideology around distrust. And that has fueled where we are today.
And it seems to be like a general premise that they are trying to control us. They are trying to mislead us. They want us to believe that this will work, but this won't work to fight COVID, or this is proper, or this is improper policy, right? It's all about they, the big bad government, again, back to institutions. There's kind of a paranoia that maybe was always around. I don't know. Maybe a pandemic ramped it up, and I almost don't make light of that, because if you look at the mental health impacts of a 3+ year pandemic, they are significant and they are real, and we've seen it have an impact.
Yeah, I think we live in a more polarized society. I think social media has fueled that.
Would you agree more paranoid as well?
I think it's more more paranoid in the sense that the paranoia has been exploited now. Do you know what I mean? So social media algorithms exploit that paranoia, right? Ideological institutions are now exploiting that paranoia, and it's creating more division. And I think it's really, it's going to sound like I'm picking on a side of the ideological, continuum. But we're talking about this cultural moment, because if you go back to like 1975, Ryan, it was the exact opposite, right? We just came out of Vietnam War, Watergate, Agent Orange, right? And at that moment, that cultural moment, it was the left, the Democrats, that were more suspicious of science, and the Republicans that embraced science, right? Go to today, and we have an exact flip, right? And so it's this in this cultural moment, in this ideological moment. Yes, a lot of this is coming from the right, but it wasn't always that way. If I could give you one really good example, one of my favorite examples of this flip, Marin County. Marin County, outside of San Francisco. Okay. Yeah, gorgeous place. One of my good friends, Jen Gunter, Dr. Jen Gunter, lives there, so I've been there many times, and she's brilliant. And Marin County is incredibly democratic, incredibly wealthy, incredibly educated, right? So you go to before the pandemic, it was one of the least vaccinated places in the United States, right? So, you think new agey, yoga, going to Whole Foods, that kind of vibe, right? Sure. The pandemic happens, Ryan, right? And being anti-vax becomes an ideological flag for the Republicans. And what happens? The Marin County flip. Marin County, presto, becomes one of the most vaccinated places in the United States, because it's all about signaling, right? All about, I'm not a Republican, I'm a Democrat, so now I'm vaccinated. And these are smart, educated people who made that flip, right? So it just shows you the degree to which this is about, signaling, in-group signaling, ideology, et cetera, et cetera.
I want to come back to storytelling and both sidesism and saving news and the information ecosystem and all that you've talked about. You wrote a book. You wrote the book, the vaccine. You wrote books on a vaccine package back in 2017. So you were writing about this, like, the vaccination picture is the book for people that want to check it out. It was published by Penguin Random House in 2017, before the pandemic. By the way, did you see that coming, or was that just a fluke? I mean, did you get lucky writing a book on vaccines right before a 3-year pandemic hits?
No, I didn't see it coming. But look, anti-vax issues had been around for a long time. Like, just think about Wakefield, right? The Wakefield legacy, and that fueled a lot of what we were talking about in that book. So Andrew Wakefield, the lie that vaccines are connected to autism. No evidence to support that at all. So
the Jenny McCarthy story.
The Jenny appears in the book, no surprise, right? So that really fueled a lot of our discussion. And we were doing research around that too, how vaccines were represented in the public sphere. And, naive me. So here I am, like, I've worked in this area for decades. The pandemic hits. And I remember saying, okay, people, this is what the world looks like without a vaccine. So I thought, the pandemic was actually going to nudge some of the anti-vaxxers in the opposite direction. Holy cow, was I ever wrong, right? Because what happened is we have this the anti-vaxxers viewed this as an opportunity, and we have this, horrible spillover of anti-vax rhetoric that's now impacting not just the COVID vaccine, but the measles vaccine, where it's like at an all-time low now. Measles kills over 100,000 people a year, mostly kids. So this rhetoric is killing children. And even dogs. People aren't vaccinating their dogs anymore. I don't know if you saw that study. No. Again, a colleague of mine did this research. In the United States, over 50% of dog owners now are hesitant to vaccinate their dogs. And the researchers did this because they were exploring that kind of spillover anti-vax rhetoric that came from COVID. And one of the main reasons that people aren't vaccinating their dogs anymore is they're worried about dog autism. I think it was 40% of people are worried about dog autism so they're not vaccinated, which is remarkable, but really shows you how powerful this rhetoric has been on public belief and discourse.
Dog autism. I'm just letting that land for a second. And I don't want to sort of like, one of the things I've learned about myself and public discourse over the past few years is, and I talked to a counselor about this, a brilliant counselor on the show, talked about our tendency to dehumanize people and to mock people and laugh at people and belittle people and punch down sometimes. And people, including me and maybe you and probably a lot of people listening to the show, have had to make a choice on many occasions how much they're going to dig into something. A friend presents a finding or a study that they've found or a link on Facebook and all of a sudden believes that they have the inside scoop on why the COVID vaccine was rushed or what went into it. All of a sudden we have the one friend that's a vaccine expert, the one friend that has reason to believe that all of science is flawed and they're tricking us. And we've all had to make our own decisions on whether we tell that person to give their head a shake or laugh or hear them out or do our own digging and see if it's a valid point, right? Yeah. I mean, we've made those decisions many, many times over the past few years.
Yeah, and I think this is a really important point because it's easy to laugh at people who think that are worried about dog autism, but we're talking about a huge swath of society.
You said 50%.
Yeah, this is a systemic issue. We can't be pointing our fingers at those individuals. I do think you can point your finger at the individuals that are spreading the lies, the Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s of the world, the Wakefields of the world. I think it's completely fair to be enraged at those individuals, but I think we have to have a degree of empathy for whenever we're engaging this. There's been a lot of really interesting research about who are more susceptible to misinformation and conspiracy theories, and there's a lot going on there, and also I've fallen for misinformation. Ryan, you've fallen for misinformation. I always make that point whenever I'm talking to the public. We have to remember that. It's such a chaotic information environment right now. It's getting more and more difficult to tease it out. And so, the bottom line is you have to try to bring a degree of empathy to these conversations.
I feel like when you invoke the name of RFK Jr., I'm thinking I haven't heard from that. It feels like we haven't heard from that guy in a while. So I Google him, and here it is at thehill.com. This was published yesterday, so this is current. The results of a recent Harvard Capps-Harris survey shows that independent presidential candidate Robert F. Kennedy Jr. currently leads the pack of 2024 presidential candidates with a high favorability rating. According to respondents of that, the poll was published on Monday, shared with The Hill, found that 52% of respondents have a favorable opinion of Kennedy. 27% had an unfavorable opinion. He also had the highest net favorability rating of 25 points. How do you wrap your mind around that?
It's just remarkable to me. The guy is he spews lies.
His family's disavowed him.
Yeah, his family's disavowed him. And it's not like, okay, and if we have time, we can get into this. It's not like
We got nothing but time.
It's not like he's talking about things that are on the margin, right? I think a lot of people say, oh, Caulfield's talking about misinformation. It's what he says is I'm talking about stuff that they're lies, right? It's not like it's not like a reasonable perspective on a controversial topic, right? There are things in the world that are lies. The world is not flat. The Trump's big lie, the election wasn't stolen, right? The U.S. government, it's not run by lizard people, right? Those things are just not true. And we also know that the vaccines do not cause autism, right? And that's just a straight up lie that he must know is a lie, given the vast amount of research that counters his rhetoric on this. So it's pretty evil, Ryan. I mean, we know that vaccines kill children. And if they don't kill them, sometimes they can have, getting measles kills children. Measles can have a long-term impact on the children's lives, right? So this is really evil stuff. So you can see I don't pull my punches when I think of people like him.
Mm-hmm. It wasn't uncommon for parents to choose to leave their kids unvaccinated 30 or 40 years ago, though, right? Do you think that there was different motivation behind it, or do you think it was the same? Do you think it was skepticism around science? What was? A friend of mine personally let us know that he was raised in a house where he was never vaccinated for anything. I was a little bit surprised, but that was his normal. You only know you're normal.
Yeah, so absolutely that was also a lot of that. And again, don't know the motivations behind this individual, where they got their information on this, but there was no evidence to support those kinds of decisions. There may have been other reasons why they decided to do that. Maybe a patient can be immunocompromised, et cetera. But a lot of those. If you look at the research, a lot of those early days concerns were, again, fueled by the Wakefield idea and this idea that kids were getting too many vaccines. We actually talk about that in the book. And there no evidence to support that concern.
Do you think, I don't know if, a lot of times people, we see these messaging campaigns, and, I saw one currently, a bus station right outside of our studio here at a busy intersection in Edmonton, right downtown. There's a bus stop with a new advertisement on it talking about the opioid crisis. And it has positive information that is not untrue. Basically says, addicted to opioids, you can get help. And then it shares a link to a sort of a detox resource, which is good. That's a good thing for a healthcare system to offer, obviously. But it's also indicative of a demonstrable change in approach with a different government on how they're going to manage the opioid crisis, right? It was the Jason Kenney school of thought is not unlike the Danielle Smith school of thought. Many of the senior cabinet ministers are the recurring names there that believe that Alberta needs to have better counseling services, detox services, inpatient services, less of a focus on harm reduction. So we see a perspective, like an ideology reflected in government messaging. Do you think that governments needed to do a better job messaging about vaccines? I won't ask if the manufacturers had to do a better job, because people wouldn't believe that. If Johnson & Johnson says take our shot, if Pfizer says take our pill, people will say, well, of course you're going to say that. So does this fall on health authorities? Did they drop the ball on conveying good information to people to quell some of those concerns, do you think?
Even Travis Kelce got, go back for his Pfizer ad, right?
He did, yeah, the NFL star, or better known as Taylor Swift's boyfriend,
I do think, and I wrote a piece on this, that we need to do a better job on science communication, full stop. Not just about vaccines. I think we do a terrible job. I sound like a conspiracy theorist, but those interested in science communication, early days, in the pandemic in particular, but I think we can make broader strokes on this. better job talking about scientific uncertainty, right? Because there is scientific uncertainty often, right? So I think what often happens is you err on the side of being a little bit dogmatic, a little bit over certain because you want to give people actionable advice, right? Let's not make this ambiguous. Let's give people actionable advice. And then if you modify that, it looks like you were wrong before, and I thought you were following the science. So I think it's really important to make sure that the science, when you're talking about a pandemic, climate change, on and on and on, you talk about the areas where the science is evolving, because science is always evolving. It's not a list of facts, right, Ryan? It's a process. And communicate the actionable items and make sure people know this could change if the science changes going forward.
We haven't even. This is so funny. This is our intro. But I said to you before we started, we'll lead with Preston Manning's panel. You went, yeah, perfect. So this is the intro. We've now been talking to Professor Tim Caulfield for about 25 minutes. Good, solid intro. So now let's get into it. I want to take a look at the live chat as well. It's humming, which is the case every time you're on the show, and we sure appreciate that. But before we get into this, the findings of this COVID panel, obviously a taxpayer funded panel that was commissioned by the Danielle Smith government. I want to let you know that these conversations are happening because of Real Talk partners like our friends at California Closets. And this is something, I'm going to just show this to you on YouTube. I'll describe it for those of you listening on the podcast. You want to see what sort of a game changer it is when you start working with California Closets. Our family has had this experience personally. You look at a space that you're using and you just know for a fact you're not maximizing it. Like, do you have pairs of shoes going all the way up the stairs? Do you have a couple of suit jackets hanging off the Peloton? Do you have the clean laundry folded but not put away because there's simply no space? California Closets wants to help you solve all of those issues, and it all starts with a free design consultation. You can get in touch with them today. They do garages too. Amazing work there at californiaclosets.ca. We also wanted to, for those of you that are dreaming of leading teams and making a real impact in the world, maybe you want an education that could lead to a fulfilling career in many thriving and growing industries. Is that what you're looking at? You're at that point in your life where you're going, I'm looking to make a game plan for the next 25, 30 years. What does that look like? Nate's J.R. Shaw School of Business could very well be your answer. They're one of Canada's leading polytechnic business educators, experts in harnessing inner talent, building skills, feeding curiosity. Your future will be brighter because of their immersive style of learning and deep relationships with industry. Graduate with the in-demand skills that future employers are looking for. Get down to business today with Nate's J.R. Shaw School of Business at nate.ca/business. And a quick mention, a shout out to our friends at Grand Dog Essentials Quality Raw Food. You know that our dogs have benefited health-wise and otherwise from eating quality raw food from Grand Dog Essentials. Well, I wanted to let you know for the month of November, for Real Talkers only, they've got the beef and chicken raw pet food, the blend. They've got it right now on sale, $10 off every 40-pound box. And here's the beautiful part about it. It's suitable for both dogs and cats, prepared using Alberta-raised chicken and beef sourced from human-grade facilities. Say goodbye to synthetic vitamins and minerals that are found in a lot of the kibble brands. This blend uses a high variety of organ meat, more than any of the other raw food brands in Alberta. Now, why is that a big deal? Because organ meat is considered nature's multivitamins for your pets. If you want to take advantage of that offer, just go to their website, granddog.ca. Remember, the promo code REALTALK knocks 10% off your first-time order, delivered to your door in Calgary, Edmonton, and Central Alberta. That's Grand Dog Essentials Quality Raw Food. We've all been there, or most of us have anyway. We're sending a text message, we're sending an email, a DM, and you realize you've sent it to the wrong person. Or maybe on a reply all, you included somebody that wasn't supposed to be there. I have to assume that's what happened earlier this week with Preston Manning, who sent out an email to his CPC friends, his Conservative Party of Canada friends, saying, I hope all is well with you. But here's the thing, to cut to the chase, George Chahal is on there, the Liberal member of Parliament. And so this is where it gets interesting, and that's how we have access to this private email. George reads, along with everybody else, that Preston writes, as you may know, for the last year, I've been chairing this panel for Alberta's Premier Smith to examine legislation authorizing the orders and regulation where the government of Alberta responded to COVID-19. He says the Alberta government, to its credit, the only Canadian government to have commissioned such an investigation. He announces to these email recipients that the panel report is now complete, has been submitted to the Premier, and is being released. He says, please note, a heads up, the news release has also been sent to Pierre, obviously Mr. Poilievre. He says if the response of the Liberal NDP coalition to the COVID crisis should become an election issue in 2024, interesting, an election in 2024, not so sure about that. He says there may be some material in this report that could be used by the Conservatives to say what should have been done to cope with the COVID crisis and future emergencies. He goes on, quote, some of its content may also be useful in attacking the record of the Liberal NDP coalition in the area. He goes on and says there's a special note to Edmonton area Conservative MPs, the area of the province where the Premier and the United Conservatives need extra support for the report and politically. Goes on, Preston Manning. In general, it seems to me there would be real merit in developing a closer practical relationship here in Alberta between the UCP and the CPC. What does this have to do with managing COVID? Nothing, of course, is the obvious answer. He goes on to say they need your support for some of their initiatives, like promoting and implementing the recommendations of this report. They could use your active support for re-election in 2024. I'm wondering if maybe a small task force of interested Conservative MPs, UCP folks could be put together to jointly pursue this objective. He says, best to all of you, call me if you have any questions. Preston Manning, and leaves his personal phone number there, which is, of course, blacked out. So much for a nonpartisan report endeavoring to figure out best practices for managing pandemic. This was politically motivated and is being politically weaponized, and you get it straight from the horse's mouth. Nobody's surprised.
No, wow. I mean, it just confirms what we all knew. We all knew this. And also, given the tone of the report, the recommendations in the report, it makes it even more frustrating.
Yeah, so I want to get into some of the recommendations with you on, like, as mentioned, obviously you're a professor of health law, of science policy. But first, I want to also note that our friends Cheryl Oates and Erica Barudis touched on this in their new podcast, The Discourse. It comes out every Friday. You can subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find those links in the show notes for this episode of Real Talk. Erica, of course, former principal secretary for Danielle Smith. Cheryl, former director of communications for then Premier Rachel Notley. And Cheryl took aim at this report in their most recent episode, which was out just a couple of days ago. Here's a snippet.
So the government did this report led by former Reform Party leader Preston Manning. Like you said, 90 recommendations coming out of this. Most of this is fluffier stuff or political cover for what I think the top lines of what this panel is recommending which is medical professionals should not have ultimate authority during a public health emergency, and that the government will now consider in its decision-making alternative scientific narratives, which that term in itself just makes me laugh. A very diplomatic way to say that ideology will come before evidence and before science when governments have to make decisions like they did during COVID-19. I mean, keeping in mind that Danielle Smith was elected as leader of the UCP on a promise not to bring back mandates, not to bring back lockdowns. She now does have a responsibility to those who elected her to fulfill that mandate, which, I'm saying is the UCP, not the people of Alberta, to fulfill that mandate and bring forward a report like this. Doing this broader piece, like you've talked about, I think Albertans should be worried, because what this report does is concentrate all of that power, all of that decision-making in a public health emergency with a politician. And Danielle Smith is not a doctor.
That was Cheryl Oates in the most recent episode of The Discourse.
I agree with all the above. I mean, the report is so frustrating, Ryan. I tried to go into it with an open mind. Yeah, look, I have my own biases and my own preconceived notions. But when it dropped, I have to say I was surprised how incredibly disconnected from the evidence, from the existing science it actually was, and how clearly this was about ideology. Do we need to learn from how we handled the pandemic. Of course, we can do better. Were mistakes made? Absolutely. It was a crisis. It was a pandemic. But I think we can't forget that hundreds of thousands, millions of people died as a result of the pandemic. And the evidence tells us that the measures that were used worked. They saved lives. Could they be more targeted? Probably. Could we learn from what kind of measures are going to be less invasive in the future? Perhaps. We got to learn all that. Everyone agrees. I've never met someone who doesn't agree that we should learn from the past. But all of that seems to be completely ignored in the report. The main message, I totally agree, is less science. Let's have less science. Let's have less expertise. Let's have more ideology during the next pandemic. And let's have, and this is, for my own area, let's have more tolerance for bunk, for pseudoscience. We need to tolerate pseudoscience more. And I think it's really, really important. There's this fake narrative in this report. Somehow these alternative approaches were ignored. They weren't ignored. They weren't ignored at all. In fact, our own research has shown that these alternative views, and let's not forget, what they're talking about here is, dude, we need the vaccines. Did ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine, that's what they're talking about. Herd immunity, right? The Great Barrington. Those, in fact, we did a study on that exact topic, and we found that it wasn't ignored. It was overrepresented in the public sphere, right? And I think it's really important to recognize that these views did not accord with the scientific consensus, and they weren't ignored. In fact, they were studied. We used scientific method to look at those, and they were shown to be not effective, or the science didn't support the approach. They weren't ignored at all. They were overrepresented in the public sphere. And I think this is really important, they were studied and then dismissed, right? And what he seems to be proposing is that not only do we consider these fringe views, but when these fringe views are shown to be wrong, we still consider them. Right? So it's because of that, it really is an anti-science approach. It's not only this idea that we shouldn't just look at science. I think there's a line in there where we're supposed to look at non-scientific approaches when we're doing an evidence-based review. It's not just that. It's anti-science, and that's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking and nonsensical.
One of the things that's kind of jumping out at me, that if you ask kind of just the average person, the lay person on the street, what they're taking away from the Manning report, I think that one of the key ones or the main ones is that politicians should be calling the shots in a health emergency, not health professionals. And I would point out that kind of is the way that it was. Like, everybody will remember in Alberta, I'll reference Alberta here. I recognize we have audience elsewhere. We could talk about BC or Ontario or elsewhere, but in Alberta, Dr. Dina Hinshaw was providing advice and counsel to the government, but at the end of the day, it was the health minister, Tyler Shandro, and the premier, Jason Kenney, that were calling the shots. That was not the case, right?
That's right, and we have a court decision that basically confirms that, and because of that, they said, these decisions weren't valid. And what the Manning group is trying to do is to institutionalize that approach, right? So are you saying that approach works? So you're not critical of that approach, and which seems to run counter to, paradoxically what they're complaining about in this report. So you can't have it both ways. And of course, this idea of having ideology rule public health decisions is bizarre. We're talking about people's lives, and that doesn't really come up in this report at all. We're talking about children. We're talking about human beings dying, and you don't really see that in the report at all.
I recommend that people subscribe to Professor Lisa Young's newsletter. She's a political science prof out of the University of Calgary. It's called What Now? An Alberta Politics newsletter. Her most recent one, which came out just on the 17th of November, she admits, I've struggled to write something about the Manning report. Johnny, we can break protocol and you can show my inbox on the screen if you want. We have a rule on the show. We don't show my email inbox because you never know what's going to be in there. But Lisa's piece is really good. Constructive and democratic discourse, it reads. And she says that she's really wanted to have an open mind, how democracy requires empathy, a genuine attempt to see things through the eyes of fellow citizens who don't share one's own experience and perspective. And so she goes on, and she's taking us into her thought process as she's analyzing this report. She says, but if that's the bar, multiple perspectives seeking to understand for democratic discourse, the Manning report fails abysmally. She says, nowhere in the report is sympathy expressed for the thousands of Albertans who've died of COVID or those who mourn them. Nowhere in the report do we read about the experiences of healthcare workers, teachers, frontline workers disabled by long COVID. Those Albertans don't even warrant a mention. In the 114-page report, the only Albertans deserving of empathy or public policy response, according to the report, are those who felt their freedoms were unduly restricted. A search for the words dead, deaths, and fatalities yields 6 mentions. A search for the word freedom finds 262. Had the Manning panel, writes Dr. Young, bothered to look at any of the publicly available survey data, it would have found that those who felt restrictions were too stringent were in the minority. Unfortunately, there was a remarkable lack of curiosity and empathy in the panel's approach. That from Dr. Lisa Young.
Oh, what a great piece, and stuff we've already talked about here today. And the other thing that's missing in there, there have been studies as reference that show that Canadians want, not surprisingly, they want their public health policy to be informed by science. That, if you go out and ask people, that's what they want. Could we do a better job communicate? If you're struggling to find some kind of constructive thing to say about the report, is the recommendation that we do a better job communicating about public health measures. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion that many other people have made also. But if you ask Canadians, most Canadians and most Albertans, they want their public health decisions to be informed by science and the best evidence.
Can you believe that we even say some of these things out loud?
I know, it's crazy.
Like what you just said, if you ask most people, they want their public health decisions guided by science. Yeah, but you have to say it out loud these days.
Yeah, we're in this bizarre dark age, right? Where, one of the things I think is so funny is we're getting a little esoteric here, but it's this postmodern view of the world, right? That all knowledge is relative, that there's no right answers. And what I find so ironic is that's kind of a hard left idea, right? Foucault and Derrida, all these things that in the past the right thought was, how can you talk this way? Reality is here, and now we have Trump and the alt-right embracing postmodernism. Where do we live? What's going on?
Do you think Trump's going to win the next election?
I don't even. Just you saying that, I got like this feeling in my stomach.
Which means you probably deep down feel like the answer
I don't know
is yes.
I think he's going to win.
Yeah, I do too.
And RFK Jr. is an interesting part of this story, right? Because it might come down to, where does RFK Jr. steal votes?
Yeah.
Right? Does he steal it from Trump, which is possible, right? Or does he steal it from Biden? Can you believe that this is the world we live in? That the leader of the United States of America is going to be determined by an anti-vaxxer?
Yeah, I saw somebody tweet yesterday, wish I could credit them. A pundit out of the States said, we deserve better than Trump versus Biden. Yeah. And I agree with that sentiment. I think that if we perceive, or if we see that Trump perceives RFK Jr. to be stealing his votes, he will turn on him fast. So it'll be interesting to watch if and when that happens. Let's get to this. It seems like, to wrap, and we appreciate your time. We've kept you longer than we asked for, but I'm assuming you're in for it.
Absolutely.
You haven't been eyeing up the door yet. But that whole idea of, as Dr. Young writes, as you've been talking about, of considering different perspectives. My notes earlier today about dehumanizing people and wanting to hear people out in good faith, but also having a line where we go, listen, anything past this is bullshit, quite frankly, and I'm going to call a spade a spade. You've written a piece recently. People can check it out, healthydebate.ca. We'll link to it in the show notes. We see two people, Stickman. Did you draw these, by the way?
I did.
August? No. Truth and conspiracy on a seesaw. And you ask, is both sidesism killing us, and why scientific consensus matters?
It is killing us. It is killing us. And what I mean by that is, scientific consensus matters. And when you say the scientific consensus, you might even get some comments on this. People say, oh, he's talking about, groupthink or, this ridiculously conservative view of, and silencing and censorship of the other side. That's not it at all, right? This is how scientific, science works. When people get on a plane, they want that plane to be constructive based on scientific consensus. When they go over a bridge, they don't want to go over a bridge that was built, an alternative view of physics, right? So in most aspects of our lives, we completely accept that there's something called the scientific consensus. But when a topic becomes polarized, like vaccines, like climate change, like GMOs, all of a sudden there's these fringe views that deserve to be given more weight than the science dictates that they should. And that's both sides. We think of false balance. We often think about it in the context of the media, where they give one side too much credit than it deserves. But what's happening now is social media and public discourse is making false balance the norm, and we really need to talk about what the scientific consensus actually says. And let me just give you one study that emphasizes how important this is. So there was a study that was done in Europe, and they asked about vaccines, about the COVID vaccines. 90% of the people they surveyed, 90%, Ryan, thought that the clinicians and the experts were divided on the safety and efficacy of the vaccines. 90% thought that clinicians and experts are divided on the safety and efficacy of the COVID vaccines, which is just not true at all, right? And when you tell people what the actual scientific consensus is, they do change their mind. Not everyone, but you move the needle. Colleagues of mine did a study colleagues from UBC in BC, and they asked 135 experts, so infectious disease experts, is the COVID vaccine safe and effective? 99% said it was. Right, safe and effective, and no worries with it.
That's more than the dentists that recommend Colgate.
But if we went out in the street and asked Canadians, they wouldn't believe that. They would think, oh, people are, one group thinks this.
They're split.
They're split. It's just not the case at all, right? And it's really important to recognize scientific consensus does evolve. And when those fringe views emerge, people go, what about Galileo? What about plate tectonics? And we used to think stress cause ulcers, right? Those fringe views are put out there. And by the way, all of those ideas were put out in a scientific forum and then tested using science. And then it slowly became the scientific. They didn't go on, a podcast and rant. They didn't go on a cable news show and rant. They didn't go on social media and rant. They went to the laboratory and they tested their fringe ideas to get convincing evidence to show. And they didn't ignore the science that told them that they were wrong, right? They were scientists. And unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be happening anymore. Fringe views are elevated to the point where they've become sort of dogma, and we have reports coming from Alberta that valorize those positions.
Well, and this is what we'll wrap with today, is just talking about, you want to talk about faith and trust in institutions. Let's wrap by us looking in a mirror, by me looking in a mirror, but by this entity, a talk show, and then the more serious journalists, the people that are writing long form, the people that are writing in magazines and publishing those reports and interviewing the experts tirelessly. And people will say, and pick an issue, I'm not going to drag you into Israel and Hamas. People are very critical of our coverage, which is fine. Other people are appreciative of it, and we're going to get to a few emails on that today. Where is the perspective on Palestine? Where is the perspective on a ceasefire? Where is the inadequate perspective or coverage of what it's like to be a Jew in Canada right now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And quite frankly, we could do 5 talk shows a week on just that. During COVID, it was, where is the perspective? If you're talking a lot about the lockdowns, and there really weren't lockdowns, but let's say the measures. If you're talking about the measures, where is the story of the small business owner that had to close up shop? Where is the story of the person that had a brain aneurysm after or a heart thing, a heart incident after they got the vaccine? You're not telling, you're censoring, you're suppressing those stories. You can't be trusted. We've heard it so many times. And I think that, to state the obvious, that's the root of a lot of the erosion of trust when it comes to that fourth estate, to the media.
Well, I do think we need to listen. And, there's been people have argued that the media needs to make editorial decisions about how they cover things to sort of represent that. But at the same time, Ryan, we have to be careful not to feed the false balance, right? By sort of highlighting those stories in a way that makes it sound like, okay, the scientific consensus isn't true because of this story. Because we know that anecdotes, testimonials can have an outsized impact on perceptions. I mean, we've done some of that work at our institute. A lot of studies have shown that. But absolutely, the other thing I think we need to do is be more transparent about how media works. We have to talk about journalistic standards and how those play out. And we also have to, I think, talk about how science is funded, researched, and published, so people have it, appreciate more. So not only is the science there, it's trustworthy science, and everyone understands where it's coming from.
Do you feel, I would make you a little bit uncomfortable for a second, or maybe not? I don't know if anything does. One of the loudest criticisms I see aimed at you is that you're on the take.
Oh,
right?
my God.
People have seen stories about the funding you've received for your studies, the fundings that your groups have received, these panels of researchers that you work with. And essentially the implication is, of course, you're going to say all this, Professor Caulfield. They're padding your pockets to do so.
Yeah, it's lie after lie after lie is said about me and my team, right? And it's really frustrating. I have never received industry funding for any of my research ever, Ryan.
Wow.
Ever in 30 years. And I'm not necessarily saying receiving industry funding. A lot of my colleagues partner with industry to do research. I'm not saying it's necessarily bad, but I know the kind of work that I do. So it is, sometimes I do get upset about that I've actually really tried to shield my work from industry funding, right? So I've never received industry funding for my work. I have never personally received a dime to say a particular thing, ever.
I've never seen you respond with that publicly. Are you disinterested in?
I have responded on. I've done it on social media, of course, and of course they say, "Oh, that's lies," and I disclose where I get all of my money. The most corporate things I do is I work. I have a commercial publisher, and I work with commercial media company, and but that's outside my research, and they're not getting funded by big pharma, so it's a complete lie. And the other thing I think is really important is they often say, probably once a day, someone will take an Edmonton Journal story of me, and I received $300,000 to do misinformation research. I wasn't paid by Trudeau to spread his narrative. I went through peer review. I competed with other researchers across Canada, very low acceptance rate. It's an independent peer review committee. They make a determination, independent from the government, who gets funding, and I go and do research. I don't get the money. They all think it went to my personal bank account.
Sure.
The University of Alberta holds the money. There's this incredible accounting that we need to do. Ryan, I want to be careful here because I don't want to get the CIHR mad at me. It's such a hassle that it's almost not worth it. And I share the money with 3 institutions, University of Regina, University of Calgary, and our team. And I use the money to pay for trainees, right? To pay for trainees to do the research so they can build their career. And it's held up as if I've been bought out by big pharma or by the Trudeau government. And it is maddening. You can tell that I don't normally get frustrated.
Well, you're a little passionate, but I think
it's
you
so
could
mad.
get
It's
more
a
mad than that.
lie.
Yeah, well, basically, when I've got a buddy, a shout out to Redbag, he'll get in anybody's face, and he's doing it jovially and for fun, but he'll say, "You questioning my character, kid? You questioning my character?" People don't like to have their character questioned, and that includes you.
They go after my, integrity, but not just me, my team, right? Because I have emerging scholars who are way smarter than I am working with me, and it impacts them too, and it is maddening, especially when you've tried so hard to walk a path that avoids this exact discourse.
I can't tell you how much I enjoy chatting with you, and just your depth of understanding of not just the subject matter, of health law and science policy, which is what you teach obviously at the U of A, but also just your understanding of people and how we're wired and how we think and how we behave. I appreciate it. Professor Tim Caulfield is the host of A User's Guide to Cheating Death. You can find that online. Of course, I was so proud to see you on Netflix with that. He's the author of several best-selling books, including Relax, A User's Guide to the Age of Anxiety, The Science of Celebrity, Is Gwyneth Paltrow Wrong About Everything? And The Vaccination Picture. Do you have the new book named yet? Or?
I do. I think it's going to be called The Uncertainty Illusion, or the certainty. I should get my own certainty illusion.
We're putting you on the spot, so you didn't know you were going to be answering
the certainty illusion, and it explores how our information ecosystem is rigged to lie to us.
I can't wait to read it. I can't wait to have you back to talk about it. Thanks for doing this.
Really enjoyed it, Ryan.
You bet. That's Professor Timothy Caulfield. You can follow him on Twitter at Caulfield Tim. Let us know what you thought about this interview to talk@ryanjesperson.com. This was presented by Real Talk partners like our friends at Kubi Renewable Energy. They want to let you know right now that their ever-expanding team is in search of talented individuals to help Western Canada remain a leader on the renewable energy front. Make sure you take that mug with you, Prof. All right, there you go. Happy to know that'll be with you in your office. Kubi, right now, we love making these announcements for partners of ours. They're seeking a new horizon in your electrical career. I feel like we're maybe speaking to one person in particular that's just, they love being a Sparky, but they're looking for a new challenge. Well, join Kubi and make an impact as a solar installer. Guarantee your skills will be cherished, and they're going to provide you with comprehensive solar training to make sure that there's a seamless shift. So many members of their team, for example, have come out of oil and gas. They're finding new opportunities in the green field. Get ready to master solar system installations and shine with Kubi Renewable Energy. Check out the careers link at kubienergy.ca. Our friends at Friesen Brothers want to remind you, before you know it, it's going to be the 1st of December. And, of course, that means another 15% off promotion at all 16 of their locations. That's coming up next Friday. Next Friday, 15% off all grocery purchases of $75 or more. Plus, seniors discount days, 10% off, different days for different locations. So check out their website at friesen.com. And for a limited time, they've got mincemeat pie available. Get ready for the holidays at Friesen Brothers, Alberta grown and Alberta owned. Hey, if you're planning on hosting something special this next summer, you're going, are you serious, Jespo? We're not even through the holidays. I haven't even figured out what we're doing for New Year's Eve yet. All I'm saying is that if you're going to have an anniversary party, a graduation celebration, maybe an engagement party, whatever it is in your backyard, and you know you want to spruce it up a little bit, you want to bring that space to life, now is the time to make contact with Eden Landscaping. They're a full-service custom landscape builder with more than 20 years of on-the-ground experience in Edmonton and area. I've worked with them personally. My wife, Carrie, and I, you can check out her Instagram reels at Carrie Skelton if you want to see our backyard reveal. I can tell you this, the planning process is so much fun because you've got the big ideas. You don't have to figure out how to make them happen. That's what Eden does. That's part of the beauty of working with them. You can learn more at landscapeedmonton.ca. And you also want to mention our friends at Complete Care Restoration. You know, they're busy right now, of course, helping people get back on their feet. Wildfire season was, man, they had all hands on deck across the province here, making sure that people's homes and businesses are built back to how they were before as soon as possible. But the team at Complete Care Restoration are also experts in all construction and renovation. So whether that's a developed basement, whether that's an overhauled kitchen, or maybe it's converting office space into condos, Complete Care does it with talented professionals that are certified for the specific areas that they specialize in. You can learn more about how they provide above-the-norm levels of customer service by checking them out online at CompleteCareRestoration.ca. Interesting note from Ken here on the chat. I saw he wonders, will the Manning report, that COVID report, lead to health workers being allowed to work in children's hospitals like the Stollery or cancer centers like the Cross or the Tom Baker down in Calgary without vaccinations for measles, hepatitis, etc.? He says, I sure hope not. Of course, Ken's alluding to the fact that these would be nurses and doctors working around immunocompromised people, which could be really interesting. We also are grateful. I just noticed that Ken also hit us up in the super chat with a $5 contribution to our beer fund, which we sure appreciate. Ken, he says,
thanks for lunch.
Great job as usual. Thanks for lunch, Ken. He says, Jespo, he says, you've got the trolls humming, which is a sure sign of success. Yeah, that might be Caulfield as well. I'm not joking. Like when that guy gets on Twitter, I just go, I thought I had it bad every once in a while. You feel a little bit, kind of like you're being piled on, and then I look at what he deals with and I go, this is nothing. We're in like the Pollyanna state right now compared to him.
Well, he's got a lot of passion. He's got a lot of conviction, right? So he's not just like delivering information. So I can see how people want to attack him, but he's very intelligent. He's very, whenever we're on here, the vaccine thing always comes up, and it's so funny because, I mean, I feel like we're going back to a year and a half ago. We talked about this on every show, but I have people. I saw someone this week who unfollowed me, and I didn't do anything. And then I was like, oh, why'd this person unfollow me? And then I went and checked some of their stories, and they're down these rabbit holes of like, it's not just vaccines anymore. These same people are like talking about chemtrails and stuff like that. And I'm like, this is just so far off. It's crazy. But yeah, every time we talk about vaccines, I just point to like real actual studies. But then people who want to argue about that, they don't, like, even in the chat today, we had some people saying, research is funded by universities. And I'm like,
well, yeah.
Well, of
so
course
is everything
it is.
else.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, and also, like, if we're going to say, like, research is, I mean, this just feels like such an obvious thing to say, but if research is funded and scientists are funded by either post-secondary institutions or government or industry, which can be a gray area, right?
Of course.
Like, people will
but how
always,
else do we get it done?
Well, and that's
Like,
a lot of the reason why research isn't getting done in some areas. Like an example might be, and gosh, if Caulfield was still in here, he might raise his eyebrows. He'd hit his hairline when I start talking about when you don't want to talk about alternative health therapies and, for example, how cannabinoids, like how the cannabis plant could be integrated into people's health. There's not a lot of research on that. And why is there not a lot of research on that? Because the industry itself can't afford or won't afford the research, and because Big Pharma has no motivation to do so at this point. So that's like one example. But let me ask you this. If you're cynical about the findings of research that is funded, then why would you not be cynical around the decisions of political parties that are also funded?
that are funded by way.
Who do you think is funding political parties, and what do you think? And there's, by the way, there's nothing wrong with making a donation or a contribution to your political party. That's fine. But let's put all the cards on the table.
But
let's
politicians have an
recognize-
agenda. Period.
Of course.
Whereas research, you're just trying to figure things out. I don't get where people think, where do we get the money for research? Where should we get it from? Should we just, like, it costs millions of dollars to do this. I mean, the last research we did on kids and vaccines and autism, 660,000 kids they researched for 11 years. How much do you think that cost? And they still didn't like the findings. They still don't believe the findings. So, I mean, what's the point even?
Yeah. You can let us know. I know there's a lot of you just commenting on how you'd love to hear Professor Caulfield on the show more frequently, which I think would be great. Obviously,
Bro, he's busy. He's on Netflix. He's on
Netflix. He's writing books all the time. I don't know when he does it, but we sure do it. We usually, we typically have one a couple times a year, maybe a few times a year. We did mention that we hear from a bunch of you, obviously, and I'm not reading all the emails we've received, but I've got a few chosen here from different perspectives about our coverage of certain issues. I got an email from a guy the other day. I'm not going to show it on my screen. I'm still chewing on it, but do you remember we were talking about trans healthcare, and in particular, a new clinic that's coming to Alberta to support people that have more specific requirements or needs, or there's deficiencies system wide. There are systemic deficiencies in healthcare for trans Canadians, and we had that conversation. Somebody wrote in to say, in a rather thoughtful way, that they felt like our conversation there was one-sided, that we hadn't represented the other side of the coin, the other perspective, how in their estimation, that approach to healthcare provision could be harmful. Now, I know what some of you are going to say. You're going to say, was that person trans? And if that person isn't trans, then take that email for what it's worth. Others of you will say, well, if you believe it to be an incorrect or an argument, mired in fallacy, then what do we have to lose by hashing it out or digging into it or putting it through a purity test, so to speak? We get emails like this all the time from people that recognize in their own interpretation, they feel like we're not doing a good enough job of telling the full story. We welcome that criticism. It doesn't mean that we're always going to agree with it, but we want you to know that we do consider what you send to us, that we do our best to read every single email, and we try to respond to as many as we can. Like this one from Michael. Michael wrote in on Saturday, the subject line, Israel-Hamas. He says, I just want to say it out loud. After hearing from Tasha Carradine on Real Talk, Bruce Arthur, he says, more please, and others whose names I'm forgetting, he says Allegra Pacheco on the 2nd of November has to have had the most Pollyanna take on calling for an Israeli ceasefire. What an absolutely absurd fantasy, says Michael. I don't want any more loss of life on either side. And this is arguably the messiest, most complex situation in history. But to say that one side should stop shooting when they have the upper hand with hostages on the other side, it was ridiculous and it was ignorant. Michael says, by the way, I love that you take off the filter once in a while, like at the end of your Seeking Solutions episode, and just let some of your most foolish critics really have it. That from Michael. That was the part where I said I'm being a little bit unprofessional right now. I got a text from a guy that said, be more unprofessional more often. This one from Kyle, who says, Israel-Hamas has made me lose faith in my generation. Ryan, as Israel and Hamas, this war continues to rage, supporters of both sides are becoming even more radicalized. As most conflicts involving Israel and Palestine do, we have seen the divide on the political and Western versus anti-Western spectrums. I'm generally pro-Israel, says Kyle, which puts me at odds with those my age, the 18 to 25 demographic. But to my horror, I see Osama bin Laden's letter to America trending on TikTok, Twitter, and Twitch for all the wrong reasons. Millions of people supporting and parroting these anti-American and de facto anti-Canadian lines, stating how Israel is just like America and deserved October 7th like America deserved 9/11. Now, I understand that people my age were barely alive, if at all, during 9/11 and only saw the war on terror, but to be spouting 2002 Al-Qaeda propaganda, Al-Qaeda, on why American values need to be destroyed is beyond disheartening. I feel that people will take the anti-American side without knowing what they're supporting, especially with the martyring of bin Laden in this case. He says, also, I know how much you support Paula Simons. I don't know if I support Paula. I mean, she's a pal. He says, but I take real objection to her statement that Muslims and Jewish people have a common enemy in the right and that they could coexist against that common enemy. He says, I would say, look at which political groups are landing where with this war. The NDP have had to expel members for supporting Hamas. I think he's talking about Sarah Jama in Ontario. He says, we have Communists for Hamas rallies in Edmonton, and at the NDP convention, a policy to dismantle Israel. And then Kyle leaves us some suggestions for guests. He says, here's a middle-of-the-road one. And then he says, but if you're really looking for unhinged, he gives us another suggestion. We never deliberately reach out to find an unhinged guest, but every once in a while they land in our lap. And this one from Jenny, who says, Ryan, a lot has been said about me over the course of my life, but one thing I've never been accused of is keeping my mouth shut for some strange reason. It's weird. In all seriousness, though, I love a good, messy conversation as long as it's in good faith. But lately, I feel like I don't have the energy for it, especially when it comes to talking about Israel, precisely because I find good faith so utterly lacking. She says, I'm a Jew, so all the free Palestine toddlers can go ahead and totally disregard me. But she says, look, there's a lot of good activism going on right now, and not a speck of it is coming from that crowd. Jews constantly have to reassure everyone and their damn dog that, yes, we totally agree that the Israeli government is evil and that the IDF is even worse. And no, we totally want peace with Palestine, and how dare we want a homeland because the world is totally safe for us. Meanwhile, Palestinians might as well tattoo on their foreheads that, yes, they agree that Hamas are terrorists and the October 7th massacre was most definitely a very bad thing, and Israel totally has a right to exist. All to appease the little feelings of a bunch of gaping, flower-scented assholes who have a right to their opinions, and it's exhausting. Jenny says, so in that light, may I just send out immense gratitude for the audience members I see in the comments on YouTube, on Twitter, wading into those ugly conversations. I love to see it. It's so easy to feel isolated and to feel othered right now. And the reminder that there are people out there who acknowledge complexity, who understand that any number of contradictory things can all be true at the same time, and who can have plain, sensible conversations without diving headlong into the pig wallow is an incredibly welcome one. It makes me want to invite all of you over for Shabbat dinner. Thank you, friends. You warm my wee Jewish heart. That from Real Talker Jenny, who sent us an email to talk@ryanjesperson.com. We welcome those emails, and when we get good ones in our mailbag, when it starts to fill up, we set aside time on our shows to make sure we get to those. We sure appreciate them. Thanks to everybody that took part in the conversation today. What can you do now to make sure that more people hear Professor Caulfield's important message? You can do simple things like liking the episode on YouTube, like sharing the podcast episode with friends of yours, and of course by hitting subscribe on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up on Wednesday's episode, that's tomorrow on Real Talk, we're going to get into a study on that Alberta pension plan idea. You'll never believe where it lands, but it says it may not actually be great for Alberta. Seth Klein's going to join us on Thursday to talk about plastics and the Supreme Court and the car carbon tax. And we're working on some other great stuff that we know is going to get that conversation started, but that doesn't happen without you. So we say thank you.
Real Talk is hosted by